All right, everybody. On today's Impactful Writing podcast, part of the Story Geeks network at this point, Wonder Woman 1984, a story breakdown of the DCEU's latest blockbuster. My name is Sherer. I am the co-writer of Death of a Bounty Hunter here in front of me, and the Amazon top seller Time Slingers, which is actually on the wall behind me here. As well. And joining me today, as always, is the co-writer of The Mongolian Connection, numerous comic books, and some prose as well, Caleb Monroe. Happy New Year, Caleb. How are you?
Happy 2021. I'm doing pretty well. I arrived in London yesterday, which is why we're recording at a different time than we previously did and why it's dark here. And I enjoy London and am looking forward to the time I'll be spending here. And I had some great holidays. So I would say doing well. How about you?
You know what? I cannot complain. The holidays were just basically my wife and I sitting in our house. But that was kind of a nice change of pace to a certain extent. I am kind of tired of being in my house, but I did some research, and my wife is sort of in the probably vulnerable area to COVID-19. So we're just staying pretty locked up. And for me to be able to do podcasts like this are super fun. So I'm looking forward to doing this. We of course watched Wonder Woman 1984. I think we watched it the day after it came out. I think we watched Soul on Christmas, and then this the day after Christmas. But it's gonna be really fun to talk about it. And it is fun to talk to somebody across the ocean.
Did you watch it streaming or in the theater?
Oh, streaming. There's no theaters open here. All the theaters are completely closed here.
Yeah, I remember when Tenet came out, we drove 2.5 hours to get to a theater to see it on the big screen.
Whoa. Yeah, we had the Story Geeks co-host Daryl Smith for his birthday rented out an entire theater for Tenet, and we were able to see it at the local theater, but he had to rent out the entire theater just for us there's like 10 of us in this giant theater.
That's fantastic. I did go see Wonder Woman on the big screen. I trying whenever possible to give money to theaters because I want them to still exist a year or two from now, which there's a strong chance they won't. So I made an effort to go see both Monster Hunter and Wonder Woman on the big screen for that reason. And buy food and everything.
Yeah, exactly. That's awesome. I wish we could do that. I'm actually not as big of a fan of theaters as I am being able to watch it at home because I like to watch a movie without any distractions. And my house is actually less distracting because I can always pause it and use subtitles. But I will say that the theater experience is something you cannot replicate at home. So I agree with you. I do not want theaters to close. Want theaters to keep moving. And I think that they will because there will always be a demand for it, but we may see the marketplace shrink a bit. So hopefully, if you're out there in that marketplace, you will survive this economy, and we'll get through it. I'll get through it together. Before we jump into Wonder Woman 1984, as a reminder, the Impactful Writing Podcast is now a show under the Story Geeks banner, which means you can join us live on the Fantasy Storytelling channel, which people are doing now, or on Facebook as we record, or you can listen later on the Story Geeks podcast feed. Of course, if you listen to us on the podcast feed, you don't get a chance to interact with us in the comments. So if you want to interact with us in the comments and ask questions and ask our opinion, then every other Monday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, because Caleb, what time is it for you?
It is 5:30 p.m.
5:30. If you're on the other side of the world and you're in the UK, then it is 5:30 when we will be live. And all of our shows, both the Fantasy Storytelling YouTube and the Story Geeks channel, all of our shows are produced by the Reclamation Society. So Caleb, let's go ahead and jump into this. Let's jump into Wonder Woman 1984. Now, I always like to start with a question that gets at some of our opinions because we're not an opinion podcast. There's a billion opinion podcasts. You can go listen to a bunch of different opinions on what people thought of Wonder Woman 1984. But just so that we are able to articulate some of the things that we really like about the DCEU, I wanted to dive into this question about, just like the rest of the DCEU, this film has been controversial. Almost every film in the DCEU has been controversial to some extent. Far more controversial than the MCU. The MCU, people just tend to love it. DCEU, people tend to either love it or hate it or feel a lot of different ways about it. So I'm just wondering if you could give me your top 3 DCEU films before we dive into the story breakdown and understanding the storytelling that's going on. Just want to get your opinion so that we can get our opinions out of the way and get further into this whole situation. So what do you think, Caleb? What are your top 3 DCEU films?
My top 3. First, let me say that I think that the reason DC movies tend to be more controversial than Marvel movies is that Marvel movies are translations, whereas DC movies are adaptations. And those are two very different things. An adaptation messes with structure and story, whereas a translation really just takes the same elements and puts them in a different language. And so Marvel movies tend to be, even when story elements are changed a little bit, they're changed in order to make them work still. Whereas DC tends to be more interpretation and there tends to not necessarily be that same following of major storylines in the actual DC Comics universe. It's more taking elements and putting them together and trying to interpret and adapt. So I think that's where that's the gap where all the controversy gets to come in, is because everyone has a different way. And if there's not, in the Marvel universe, even if it's not my favorite story, I can think, oh, I see what they're doing. They're doing that story, that Avengers story or whatever. They're updating it, and versus with the DCU, that doesn't really happen so much. And it doesn't happen much in the DC universe to begin with, the comics universe. Those characters are constantly being reinterpreted and relaunched and put into new continuities. And anyway, I think that's why it happens.
Yeah.
And I'll also just throw out that you're gonna find this out as you listen to me for the rest of this podcast, but I am a very charitable movie watcher. And I mean that really in the old sense, where charity means love. I see movie watching in many ways as a relational act with the creators of the film. It's an act of love and hospitality that the movies don't just entertain us, but we entertain them. And, I just happened to be reading a book last week. There was this quote: "It's a wonderful thing that here and there in this hard, uncharitable world, there should still be left a few rare souls who think no evil." And I'm certainly not saying that I achieve that, but that is how I tend to go into movies. I want to think no evil. I want to believe all things. Both of those are quotes from 1 Corinthians 13, which is what the author is referring to there, which is about love, defining love as something that thinks no evil and believes all things. So I try to take a loving approach and be charitable in that classical sense. So I'm just going to throw that out there, because in geek culture, that tends to not be the default. There tends to be critical. And often criticism totally belongs. I'm not down on criticism, but I start charitable and then will move critical. I don't think it goes the other way as often. So I'm going to throw that out there, because right away some people are going to hear me start talking and they're going to feel uncomfortable because they're like, "What? He's just he's so Pollyannish."
Can I throw something on top of that too?
Yes.
I like to take two separate things and make sure that they remain separate in my mind as I do reviews. And it's sort of similar to what you're talking about. There is my objectivity, and then there is my subjectivity. And so there are things that I subjectively love because, in my opinion, I just want to see that on the screen. Objectively, I could make an argument against it, but I do feel pretty strongly that in our current culture, because nothing is perfect, I can always have a subjectively negative view. There's no perfect film. As close as there are to perfect films, Back to the Future, I think, is pretty close to being a perfect film. There are problems with that film, and I could objectively criticize it, but I subjectively love it, right? So I think that there's an element of that too that you're talking about here. That's, look, sometimes we just love things, even if they're sometimes they can be objectively bad. but we still love them. And there's no problem with that. But there is a difference between saying this film is perfect versus this film is something I love. And I think that that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, I think there's also, I think it also sort of depends if you're looking at something with your storyteller mind or your audience mind.
Yes.
As an audience, it's more about the subjective. It's you're the audience, and how was your experience? But as a storyteller, there's a certain empathy, I guess. I know how hard it is to get any story made and out into the world and to an audience. And I know how many compromises often have to be made. And I know the competing voices involved and the budgetary restrictions and all the things that work against the perfection and even the best instincts sometimes of the people telling the story, myself included, when my stories go out into the world.
Right.
So I also just have a very, I should say, probably strong empathetic reaction to the fact that anything got made and the grueling process that involved for everyone who was part of the process. I tend to, my heart tends to go there first and then to experience the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, given that, what are your top three?
My top three. 3 is Suicide Squad, 2 is Wonder Woman, and 1 is Wonder Woman 84.
Whoa, that's surprising. That is very surprising. So we're going to get into some of the reasons why, but can you just give me a couple bullet points about what you love about each of those films and why it makes it into your top 3?
Yes. Suicide Squad has just a certain cast magic, I'll say. It's a very charismatic movie because there's very charismatic people playing the roles. To me, the characterization in that film just sticks with me, not in a way that the plot didn't stay with me. And I mean, obviously, Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn is a cultural phenomenon, partly for that reason. She's just so fascinating to watch, that portrayal of that character, who's always been fascinating, but is just quintessentially embodied, it seems, on screen. But everyone in every role in that film is just a very charismatic and interesting person. And Jay Hernandez has been one of my favorite actors for a long time, very underrated. And I was so glad to see him get, a large role in a film like this and have some meat to chew. There's the scene in the bar, the incredible chilling line where Harley Quinn tells him to own that he killed his family, is because we're the bad guys. That's such a rich and deep scene and chilling. And you want a moment of chillingness from a group of villains. And you often don't get that. It's often sort of a slapstick sort of thing. Yeah. And so, so there's some bullet points about why I love Suicide Squad. Cool. Wonder Woman, just because I think both the Wonder Woman films just nail the big screen adventure / myth / superhero dynamic in a way that the other films all tend to go towards one of those. And Wonder Woman, and as a character, she does this, and it works for her and against her, that she falls at this intersection of myth and adventure and superhero storytelling, because sometimes that can make the story feel inconsistent, that it has all these different elements and these different themes. But when they're brought together well and blended, I just love that combination, And so that's really the heart behind why I like both of these films.
Nice. Well, I would say that's probably a pretty controversial top 3, given what I know about how people respond. My number 3 is incredibly controversial because people absolutely hate this film. I really like it, especially the Ultimate Edition, but I like Batman v Superman. I think it's actually a really fun film. I think that trust me, objectively, I can criticize the hell out of that story. But subjectively, I like a lot of what it's attempting to do. I realize that it has a lot of flaws, but I think that the DCEU does something that the MCU rarely does, and that is it presents you with a moral perspective on things that is not very simplistic, that has lots and lots of different layers to it, which I don't think Marvel is trying to do at all. Marvel is sort of like, hey, let's teach our 10-year-old kids these things, right? Where I think the DCEU tends to take another deeper cut at some of the morality issues it addresses, and I think BVS does that pretty well, actually. Man of Steel, in my opinion, is a visual masterpiece, and I think Man of Steel actually has the best trailer of all time, and it's because they put together some of the most beautiful elements of that film in such a way that it is just gorgeous. So I really like Man of Steel. And the more times I revisit Man of Steel, usually the more I like it. But it's not my number one. My number one is the first Wonder Woman film, which I think you can put up against The Dark Knight or Guardians of the Galaxy as being basically the best the genre has to offer, in my opinion. Not just subjectively, but objectively, it is a really fantastic film. And I appreciate that Patty Jenkins took on the... Actually, I appreciate this a lot about most of the DCEU filmmakers. And I wish... I've read a lot about the behind the scenes. I wish there was less studio involvement in these films, because every single director that they've chosen and every single director that has made a film for them has had some really deep things to say about the world, especially in some of the other films that they've done. So you mentioned Suicide Squad. David Ayer, is it Ayer or Ayers? I never get this right. But whichever one it is, David Ayer or Ayers has some phenomenal things to say about the world in some of his films. Some very troubling things. He does not avoid the dark and gritty aspects of the human experience, and yet is able to draw out a lot of the joyous camaraderie that the human experience also has. So I just love what he does. So the fact that he's part of this, but I also know that Warner Brothers messed with that film a lot, and that there are several versions of it out there apparently. I think that we probably both have some controversy to our list, and that's just inherent in the DCEU, which is totally fine.
Any best of list is going to have that, because there's always someone you're going to say your number 2 or your number 1 or your number 3, and it's going to be someone else's least favorite. So that's just the way opinion works. So yes, always controversial.
Yeah. Well, the next question I want to get into before we start not picking apart. That sounds super negative. Before we start digging deeper into the story elements that we're going to dig deeper into. And by the way, we got a lot of really good questions from the Story Geeks Facebook group. So if you're interested in interacting with us and giving us questions even before the show starts, you can either do that live, or you can go into our Story Geeks Facebook group. The link is in the description. You can actually give us questions in advance of these shows, which is fantastic. But I wanted to touch on this before we get into those questions. You have written a bunch of comic books, including, stories for DC, which means that you have a perspective on writing comics and writing comics for DC that most of us do not have. So before we get into any specific questions about Wonder Woman 1984, I wanted to get your take on writing DC stories, both from a fan's perspective and from a writer's perspective. What's essential to a DC story in your mind?
This is tricky. When you're working for someone else, part of what you have to learn to do is to find the thing that you love the most in their sandbox. You're playing in someone else's sandbox with someone else's toys, but what games do you most enjoy with those toys, sort of thing. You have to. You are a caretaker and not a creator, and that is different, and I think it involves a different relationship to the material. So from a creative standpoint, you're there to care for something that already exists, and you want to do it justice. Justice League, perhaps.
No pun intended.
Sorry, I apologize for that incredibly bad pun.
No, that's great.
But I think what's essential to a DC story is that. I'm going to try to get to this by comparing a Marvel story with a DC story.
Oh, okay.
I love them both, but they have very different DNA.
Mm.
And part of that is because of the way the universes came to exist.
Mm.
Marvel was created all at once, and there was one imagination, Stan Lee, that was involved in all of the books at the same time. So there was a consistency of voice as the universe was created that DC never had. But also, it was being created after superhero was an actual genre. Superheroes had been around for 20 years, or was it even more than, a couple decades. And so Marvel could be created as a fully superhero universe because that genre existed. DC created that genre in matters not, because really the first Superman and the first Batman stories were pulp stories.
Right.
They were Detective Comics, was the name of is where we get DC, and then DC bought other companies and their comics and their pulp characters and sort of stitched them together so that you get a patchwork universe that was created by different minds at different companies over different years and in different eras. And so DC just has it's a collage, whereas the Marvel universe is a painting. And DC was creating things, whereas the Marvel universe was refining them, I guess. And so DC, because of that, I would say that DC stories are more adventurous. And by that, I mean pioneering, as in they pioneered the things that would later make Marvel great, or many of the elements, the superhero elements, and created that, or created a widespread version of that genre. But also, they tend to be, I think DC stories tend to be adventure stories more than superhero stories. They still have that pulp DNA. It's an adventure. It's got that Indiana Jones, Doc Savage sort of world spanning, universe spanning, just very slightly off kilter characters, and so I think, and also the DC universe is multi-genre. The Marvel universe is superhero comics. The DC universe is crime comics and flat out adventure comics and science fiction comics and superhero comics and mythological comics, and the list goes on and on and on. So DC is a multi-genre universe versus a mono-genre universe. And so I guess what all of that comes down to is, with DC, it's a little more important to pay attention to the DNA of the character that you're working with. Where did that character come from? Batman's DNA is pulp, and crime and mystery. And that's why it's very hard to make him work to his greatest strength in a space epic story or something. You have to pay more attention to where the characters come from and their histories, because that is going to give you guidance for the best ways to use them and what a Batman story is versus a Superman story. I don't think the same thing happens in the Marvel universe. It's all a Marvel story, whether it's Spider-Man or Captain America. It's a Marvel story. But in the DC universe, it's a Wonder Woman story, it's a Batman story, it's a Superman story, it's a Justice League story. And even though the Justice League has those three characters in it, it's a different story. Justice League stories are different than their individual stories. So I hope that's some sort of answer. I would just say pay attention to the DNA.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love it. So with that in mind, let's get into Wonder Woman 1984 specifically. And I want to start with the premise. So as storytellers, one of the things that we look at, you can call it the premise. I have other books on my on my table here that don't call it the premise. They call it something else, like themes or the concept or whatever they want to call it, right? But I'm going to use the term the premise. We'll borrow that from Leos Agree. Although I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Someone told me I was pronouncing it wrong one time, but I still can't pronounce it. So do what you will with it. because this is a sequel and because I love the first film so much, and it's your number 2 is my number 1, I want to talk about the two films in conjunction with one another in regards to the premise. So let's just start by defining what we believe the premises of these two films are. So what do you think? What's the premise of the first film, and then what's the premise of Wonder Woman 1984?
Let's see. I think one way to look at the premise of the first one is this sort of idea that calling is a process, not an event. That you continually throughout your life discover who you are and what you're meant for. And that's something that's a very strong thread in the Wonder Woman story, and it always has been, because she has to leave her world behind. And so one way of looking at it is that. But if I was going to choose premises that sound good because they kind of reflect off of each other for both of them, I would say that the first Wonder Woman film is the premise is it's a much bigger world than we realize. And that Wonder Woman 84, the premise is that a broken world is still a beautiful world.
Nice. Very nice.
And they're both anti-utopian, which is actually kind of goes against some of the superhero grain. Totally. Black Panther is utopian fiction. They're a perfect society. Wonder Woman, but because Wonder Woman's story focuses on her leaving utopia behind and coming into a messy world and living in the mess, there's always sort of an anti-utopian, like, we can't perfect the world. And you see that very strongly in both of them, but particularly 84. So I think I talked around it. I don't know if I gave a clear answer there.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. I have a slightly different take on it, but I think that those things are inherent in what I kind of wrapped around them from a premise standpoint as well. And I think that, so first of all, let me say that I think that both films have some of the best premises in this genre. And so the first film in my mind has one of the best premises of a superhero film that I have ever really heard. And I would define it as self-sacrificial love is what makes you a hero. And I know that that's like sort of like saying like, well, isn't every superhero movie about that? Maybe, but a lot of films don't actually go so far into the concept of, you don't get the impression that Batman loves people and it's why he punches them in the face, right? Like that's not necessarily what you would expect to have from a character. You could even see, some of the hope kind of dynamics coming out in Superman. Obviously Marvel has some of that going on, but like Wonder Woman, the first film, does like specifically tell you the objective of this life, whether you're a superhero or not, is actually love, and self-sacrificial love is what actually makes you a hero. And so you see that because you see Steve become a hero. He does not have any superpowers whatsoever, but he sacrifices himself. He has self-sacrificial love for the rest of the world, really, at that point, and he becomes a hero. And it also that impacts Diana in such a way that she's actually able to take on Ares. And so Diana becomes a hero by choosing not to side with Ares, even though she knows the truth about humans, that most of them are dirtbags, right? And she just goes, okay, well, we're just going to move on from that. So I love that premise. I think that's just a killer premise.
I agree. So I think that part of why that happens in superhero stories in general is that the Big Bang of superheroes, which is Superman, is a Moses story and not a Christ story.
Yes.
It is the story about, someone sent down the river in a basket, found, raised, and eventually raised to power and different types of power, and frees people through his power.
Yeah.
And there is sacrifice in Moses' story, but it's not an inherently sacrificial story. It's a rescue story. It's a freedom story. And it's, at the very foundation, it's a might makes right story. Right. This idea of the 10 plagues of Egypt is that, well, God is just stronger than Pharaoh. And And so that is why God wins. And
Mhm.
the Christ story is about the strongest person choosing to sacrifice themselves anyway. And I'm talking about these as archetypes,
Right.
really, because we see them in both we see both of them in superhero stories, often in the same film.
Right.
Particularly in Superman films, these really come up against each other.
Yes.
Because modern sensibility tends to want the hero to be a hero who sacrifices.
Right.
But that kind of goes against some of the DNA in the superhero, this idea of might makes right and of deliverance and
Yeah.
Deliverance versus sacrifice. So I feel very diffuse today, so I hope I'm making sense. But
No.
I think that is a reason. I think that is the reason that
Yeah.
that particular dynamic comes out in films, and that superhero films and comics are always going to bend towards Moses and might makes right, because that's what
Yeah.
where they come from.
Yeah.
But storytelling convention, the power of sacrifice, is a very primal storytelling convention, and so we want to tell stories about that.
Yes.
But we're
Yes.
doing it with this. I keep coming back to this idea of DNA when we talk about superheroes in general, but DC in particular.
Yeah, and I think you can see what you're talking about just from a different angle. I think you can see very clearly when you look at what Zack Snyder did with Man of Steel. Again, subjectively, one of my favorite films in the genre. Objectively, he's making a very clear tie between modern culture and how modern culture tends to see Jesus Christ. However, as you just stated, that character is not best compared to Jesus Christ as a conquering hero. That doesn't make sense. We don't really see Jesus as a conquering hero in the physical sense. We see him as maybe a conquering hero in the spiritual or metaphysical sense. But the reason I bring that up is because it would be much better to compare him, even if you're going to say like, well, it's Moses, or it's the embodiment of a Messiah, and what the Jewish perspective on the Messiah was. The Jewish people do not believe Jesus is the Messiah. Why? Because he did not come conquering, right? Like, he came conquering spiritually. He did not come conquering physically. And so the Superman is much more of a good comparison to the Messiah and the view of the Messiah as a physical conqueror as opposed to a spiritual conqueror. So I think that's good. I think it's good to understand where we're being influenced. Now, granted, I love the fact that DC is trying to compare these kinds of heroes to these bigger themes that we have chosen to believe in, whether it's the Judeo-Christian view of faith, or whether it's the Greek view of faith, or the Roman view of faith, or whatever. I love this kind of aspect of it. I also loved the Wonder Woman 1984 press, but it took me a little longer to get to an understanding of what that was. And some of the questions that we're going to talk about kind of get into that. I think it's a little bit muddier because of some of what goes on in the film, and we'll talk about all of those things because a lot of the questions from our Facebook group kind of hit on that. But I really did love the premise, because it felt to me like it was pursuit of personal desires puts the rest of our community at risk. And it's not even, what I loved about the film was, it wasn't, a lot of people will take that premise and they'll say ruthless pursuit of personal desires puts our community at risk. And that's a different take. You can actually just pursue your personal desires in a non-ruthless way and still put your community at risk. And I liked that Wonder Woman actually said that. It actually said like, hey, look, you might not, obviously you might say that Max Lord and, in other words, the two villains of the film are being a little bit more ruthless in their pursuit of their vision. But you could not say that about Diana. Diana is not being ruthless in any sense of the word. So I think that that's a really interesting premise to play with. And I thought it was really fun. So we did get a lot of questions, though. And the reason why I said let's look at the premise first from a storytelling standpoint is because the premise is going to, in my opinion, define how all of the other pieces fit. And so depending on how you see the premise of the film, a lot of people will do this. a lot of people, and this is why I love doing the Story Geeks podcast, it's why I love doing this podcast, is a lot of people will take in the film as an audience, like we talked about before. They'll take it in as an audience, and I've done this myself a billion times. We'll feel a certain way, and then we'll say, well, clearly what the film was trying to say was X, Y, Z. And why do we tend to say that? Because we tend to reflect our own beliefs into art. We tend to look at a piece of art and go, it speaks to me because it reiterates to me something that I want to believe. As opposed to, what is it objectively saying? And then how do I subjectively feel about what it is objectively saying? And of course, the people who make it have their subjective feelings. So it's not always an objective versus subjective thing, but you get where I'm going with it. So I think the premise is a really good thing to start with, because from a writing and storytelling standpoint, really everything in stories tends to augment or build upon the premise that the storyteller is playing with. And the reason why I love DCEU is because I think that the filmmakers are bringing pretty killer premises to the table. So I got this question. We got this question from 3 different people, slightly different versions of this question, but they were all asking. So we got it from Justin Weaver, who's the Story Geeks co-host. My Death of a Bounty Hunter co-writer Nathan Sheck asked this, and my wife asked this, all in the Facebook group. Were you satisfied with the story mechanics used to explore the premise? We just define the premise in slightly different ways, but if you're aiming for that premise, how do you think the story mechanics worked? And so let me just list those out, and then I'll get your take on it first, and then I'll give mine. There's a magical
Spoiler
stone.
alert.
Oh yeah, spoiler alert. Yeah, well, if you're ever listening to our podcast, it's like a spoiler alert every time. But yeah, you're right. I should have said that up front even earlier. But that definitely spoiler alert now. So let me just go through the major things here. There's a magical stone that grants wishes. Max Lord then uses his own wish to become the stone. So now he grants wishes. He's like a genie in some regards. And then we learn that getting a wish granted has a severe consequence. They call it the monkey's paw, which of course will probably come up later in our conversation. And then in the end, the wishes have to be recanted in order to reverse the worldwide destruction. So because there is significant consequences to getting the wish you wanted, there's a negative consequence to the world at large almost. You have to give up something to get something. That results in this chaos. Like the world just continues to descend into more and more chaos, all the way up to the president and Russia, and then we're firing nukes. Anyways, so what are your thoughts on this? Let's talk about the mechanics. There's this premise. We both agree that the premise, however you define it, whether you define it more like you or more like me, is fantastic. And then there are these mechanics, and people seem to be struggling with the mechanics a little bit. So what are your thoughts on
that? To me, I was satisfied with the mechanics. These are mechanics that belong in a myth, and they belong in a pulp story. They are not superhero mechanics, which is why I think so many people are struggling, because superhero mechanics, there has to be honest, there has to be some sort of physical component. Usually, the hero has to engage and not just wish. And so the wishing, the idea of wishing as just a story premise has been around a long time, going back even to some of the myths that Wonder Woman is based on. And so that works for me. But as we came across earlier when I was talking about DC, I come at these films as Wonder Woman in particular. It's a myth and an adventure story, not a superhero story. So I'm looking for myth and adventure premises, pulp premises, which be careful what you wish for is one of those,
Right.
And but it's not so much a superhero premise, and so I think that is where, and I don't think either perspective is right or wrong. I think it depends on what it is that we love about Wonder Woman. She's a multifaceted character, and what it is we love about storytelling and what it is we love about movies. That's where a lot of subjectivity comes in. But if you look at it as a myth or as a pulp adventure story, I think those mechanics are perfectly natural. As a superhero story, they might feel a little out of place, but in the right type of series, superhero story, they wouldn't necessarily. Because it really depends. And I think part of the problem is that it creates an inner conflict versus an outer conflict. The entire film is about it's an inner conflict in each of the characters. It's not really people fighting each other, which is what superhero comics are, people fighting each other. And so I think that's part of why it's more of a myth, more of an adventure story, less of a superhero story.
So one of the things that I really enjoy about the podcast, doing this podcast with you, is that, and we've talked about this on previous podcasts, is that you tend to approach things from a muse standpoint. I tend to approach things from a mechanic standpoint, and almost instantly my mind just starts going to mechanics. So it's interesting because when I address this question, I'm going, I love this premise, but Wonder Woman 1984 didn't make my top 3. Why is that, right? And so then I start to ask myself, what about it was not a complete symphony in my ears, right? There was some notes that I feel like I missed somewhere along the line that didn't make it a symphony. Not to say that I didn't enjoy it, right? I used to enjoy Blink-182 music, and that is definitely not a symphony. And here's what I felt like. I felt like that a premise is something that the entire film is, through the character arcs, through the character interactions, through the character motivations, everything is attempting to serve that premise. And I feel like the movie realizes what its premise is pretty late in the story. And so there are a couple things where I go, oh, that's kind of interesting from a storytelling perspective, because there are some things that I think are maybe lacking and some things that come too late. So, for example, one of the things that my wife pointed out was, she's like, I would have really liked to have seen Max Lord's flashback scene a lot earlier in the film, because I might have cared about his arc a little bit more had I known what kind of trauma he had earlier in his life and what had happened to him earlier in his life. I would tack on to that I would love to see a little bit more of his motivation. He sort of has this ruthless desire to be like the most powerful person in the universe, or in the world at least. And he's kind of constantly pursuing this health problem that he's experiencing as he gains power. But his motivation for doing all of that is a little bit, in my mind, it's a little bit muddied by like, well, why are you doing this, dude? Like, what is, yeah, I know that you have some self-esteem issues. But and that sometimes works for characters, and it sometimes works. I'll give you an example: The Incredibles, which is a superhero story, for sure, not a pulp story as much. But The Incredibles, when you see Syndrome and you see him being bullied by Mr. Incredible, by the way, and being seen as less than, and because he's younger, we kind of go along with the premise that someone who's bullied, especially someone who's younger, may want to fight back against the way that the world works. But I didn't get that as much here. And I would have liked to have seen a little more of that. And I bet you there's more of it on the cutting room floor too, I would imagine, because this film seems like it's longer than what we see in the actual final film. The other thing I think that would have been really, really good is that I feel like the monkey's paw could have been, Nathan said he felt like, in the comments that he was making, he said he felt like the filmmakers used the monkey's paw as something that they thought everyone would understand, but that even he feels like is actually a different thing than how they were using it in the film. I did not look it up to see what the exact definition of it is.
It's a story about a monkey's paw that grants wishes, and it grants 3 wishes, and it answers the letter of the wish, but not the spirit of the wish. And it goes wronger and wronger. And so it's a married couple, and the father has to undo the first 2 wishes with the 3rd wish. So that's just what it's a short story called The Monkey's Paw. It's, is it O. Henry? I feel bad for not knowing.
Well, as you look it up, I'll just say
by W.W. Jacobs. Sorry.
Okay, so WW Jacob, and by the way, what you just described is not technically, how the film is using the definition. So even if you do know what it is and know where its origination came from, Wonder Woman is saying when you wish for something, there is also a negative consequence associated. And the way you just described the monkey's paw is actually when you wish, there are unintended consequences to that wish. And that's a little bit different than saying no, that actually you have to give something up in order to get something, right? So it's a little bit different of a premise. Justin also mentioned that he was frustrated with the premise because he felt like the movie was suggesting. And by the way, I did not feel this way, but he felt this way. He felt like the movie was suggesting that you can't have what you want and simultaneously do what you're called to. I did not feel like that's what the movie was saying. Justin felt like it was that because what he felt it was saying you can't have what you want and then fully live into your calling, and so therefore you must sacrifice some of your own wants and desires in order to live into your calling. And he felt like that confused him because he just felt like, no, you don't have to give up some of your wants and desires to see your calling. I saw it more like I felt like it was more like you must sacrifice what you want in order to benefit the greater good at times. And that's a slightly different take on that same thing. So I think that could have been maybe a little clearer, but I think it's one of the reasons why I like the premise more than he does, because I think he sees the premise a little bit differently than I see it. And that's us bringing our own life experiences into this film. So I think that with a couple of those little minor tweaks, we could have seen that self-sacrifice is part of building a stronger world. But I do think it gets a little muddy when they're trying to prove out that bigger premise. So I like the way that you view it, because I like the way that you say you're able to say kind of like, look, this is where I'm going to mentally fit this movie in, and it's your favorite one in the DCEU. And so I think that's really. But my mechanic brain is like, you can't do that, man.
It's totally fine. I should say though, just the idea that you have to give something up to get something is really built into the Monkey's Paw story. The first wish is that they wish for money. The way they get it is their son is killed at work, and the insurance payment is what brings them money. And so I'm just going to clarify that. It's because I don't want to do that story injustice. It's sort of a classic. But and even when it happened in the film, I was like, I'm not sure if all these people I'm sitting with in the theater know what Monkey's Paw is.
Right.
But in the very next sentence, they explain what a monkey's paw is, or at least in the Wonder Woman world. So I was like, it was adding a little dimension to my understanding of what they're talking about, but I didn't need to know it and it created what was great about it is it created a great shorthand for them to talk about it later. You know, they could just say monkey's paw, and that whole idea was encapsulated, so. That's good. I think we should compliment that. I think that if they would have, I think it would have worked perfectly. I think if they would have introduced that concept earlier on, and we could have clearly seen that even in the first examples, when you see Kristen Wiig's character Cheetah, when she does her first wish, there's not necessarily, I don't remember it at least. I don't remember there being an immediate negative consequence. It was sort of just a positive consequence, if I'm not mistaken. And so if we had seen it introduced a little bit earlier on with her simpler wish, and there had been a simpler negative consequence, and maybe I missed it, that would have been really interesting too. I think it was a slow burn.
Yes.
Wonder Woman slowly lost her powers.
Yeah.
And Cheetah slowly gained her powers, and as she slowly gained them, she slowly lost her humanity. So I think it was always there from the beginning. It's just very hard to tell at the beginning, It's
a very good point. Yeah. It's a very good point. So before I jump into my next question, I do want to point out where you can check out Caleb's work and my work. The movie Caleb co-wrote, The Mongolian Connection, is actually available for free on Amazon Prime. You might have heard us talk about it because we were able to talk with the director and Caleb, the co-writers, a couple weeks back. Actually, more like a month back now. It seems like it was a couple weeks back.
One episode back. but
one
yeah, it
episode
was like
back.
a month
Yeah,
ago.
exactly. So you guys can go listen to that. That was a really, really fun conversation. You can rent it on various platforms. The Mongolian Connection, you can rent that on various platforms as well. But if you're an Amazon Prime person, then just go check it out. Also, you can check out more of Caleb's stuff at his website, calebmonroe.com. So definitely check that out. Death of a Bounty Hunter, this book right here, the book I co-wrote with Nathan Check, is now available on Amazon. So just go to Amazon, man. Like everything's there. Everything is on Amazon and available to you. You can go check that out and let us know what you think when you do check it out. So links to those can be found in the description down below, and we do really appreciate your support. And with that, let's jump into the next question. So we got another question from multiple people, and this deals with, as storytellers, how we incorporate or don't incorporate things in our stories that have cultural implications. So this is going to get more into a philosophy of storytelling than it is. We can talk about the mechanics of it, but there's also this reaction to culture or reaction to society. So the question comes from Rob Sherfield and Bryant Dillon from Fanbase Press. Shout out to those guys. Regarding the plot device that is used to bring Steve Trevor back. Namely, the spirit of Steve possesses this other random dude that Diana meets at a party. And so first, the first question I have for you, Caleb, is does that work in the story? The second question, as a writer, how do you tackle an issue like that, especially one that's a hot button cultural issue? So I say that because the basic premise that people have said that they're upset about is that you could accuse Diana of some version of sexual assault because she's using this guy's body as an object because Steve Trevor is possessing him. There's a question of like, is this guy still in his body? Does he know that this is going on? He's definitely not doing this willingly, given the fact that his body has been taken over. And so I turn over all of that to you. Do you think it works in the story, Caleb? And then what do we do as writers when we look at cultural issues and we try to make statements about things? How do we incorporate that, knowing that we may get some vitriol, or how do we avoid it, knowing that we may have made a mistake in the first point? So what do you think?
Oh boy, this is a complicated one.
Yeah, that's why you get to go first.
Yes, no, I'll probably say something wrong, but I think it's important to have the conversation and not draw back necessarily in fear. But I will say that I think it works in the story. I think the Steve's possession of this guy and Diana's sexual intimacy with the spirit, but not the body, are definitely, I think they're wrong. They're transgressive in a negative way. There's violation there. It's very problematic. And, but I also think it didn't need to be that wrong, but it did need to be wrong, because I think more than the fact that she lost her powers, it's that she started to lose her moral center because she wanted Steve back so badly that, that was the true loss of her power, was her moral center, not her ability to punch cars. And I think her desire is sort of unordered. To use an Augustinian phrase, she has an unordered desire to have Steve back because the implication is that he died an unnatural death before his time, and that creates a different kind of grief in you than if you just outlive someone, And so she's got this sort of unordered desire meshed with grief, and she has done something wrong. She wished for him back, and that creates more wrong. And I think that if the two of them had been around for longer, it would have become the crisis between them. Yeah. What was happening to his host body would have become the moral crisis that they had to face, the two of them. But because the world was disintegrating around them, they didn't quite get to that. But I do think like I said, I think it's definitely wrong. I think that it didn't have to be that particular wrong, but I think that there needed to be a wrongness to her wish and her desire. That's part of her inner conflict. Now, it's also that type of wrong was avoidable. I mean, it's wishes, so you can literally do anything you want,
Right.
But what I think this brings up is why I don't think that there's a definitive Wonder Woman story. Because Marston built sexuality and taboo intentionally into the Wonder Woman character. For him, he built it in there as a tool of liberation and of freedom. But taboo sexuality is something that we as a culture have a really difficult time defining and getting on the same page with. And it can get pretty messy. And so this sort of bondage and this sort of the ideas of sexuality and the ideas of taboo as liberation that are built into the character intentionally by a psychologist who was in a relationship, in a polyamorous relationship. These are things that we often, they're just really hard to tell a story with that doesn't start getting questionable. Right. And it's just very difficult. And I think that Grant Morrison does a great job in Wonder Woman Year One of summarizing the ethos that I think Marston was trying to put into Wonder Woman, which is this idea of loving submission. That's the phrase that Morrison uses over and over again. The idea that the truest use of power is loving submission to someone else's good. And that's a very heroic thing. Yes. But because Marston physically tied that to bondage and sexuality imagery, not all of us have a very healthy relationship with bondage and sexuality, and nor necessarily should we. Not all of us have a healthy history with bondage and sexuality. Right. And so it's very hard to get from that to loving submission, this idea of loving submission, and that the greatest use of power is loving submission to someone else's good. And that's what makes Wonder Woman such a tricky character, so hard to write. It seems simple on the surface, but it is incredibly difficult to pull off just because it has that DNA in it that most characters don't have. And that DNA was built in psychologically by someone who knew what they were doing. And, right. and so because of all of that, I would say, this comes up in a lot of Wonder Woman stories, not this particular thing, but some sort of sexual transgression often surfaces, or implied sexual transgression or metaphorical sexual transgression, because it's built into her as a character. And I think part of the problem is that we don't approach telling Wonder Woman stories the same way that we approach telling sexuality stories. We approach it as superhero stories, but when you introduce might makes right to the idea of loving submission, it gets real murky real fast, and it can get real icky real fast. And so I think all of that to say, I think that that's why there's not a definitive Wonder Woman story. And I think that definitely those are the rocks that this ship hit. But I do think that I don't think that the film at any point thinks that it's right. I think the whole idea is that Diana is losing her moral center to her unordered desires and doing wrong intentionally. And so okay, it's a very complicated topic. I'll stop there. And
well, first of all, let me compliment your analysis, because I think that again, understanding the backdrop of the stories that are being told can be really important to an understanding of how the stories hit us, because we may have seen several stories before this that didn't approach it in the same way, and now this hits us weird because we don't see the familiarity there. I think all of that is a really good thing to think about as you think about stories. I also think that as a storyteller, so there's a very quick mechanical fix to this problem, and that is, and you mentioned it, just don't have him possess anybody. just wish him back to life, and there he is. His flesh is all there. He's not taking over another person's body. He's just there. That's it. That's a very easy mechanical fix. Now, could you get into a more complex? I don't think this film is trying to get into a more complex gray area. I think you're right by looking deeper into it and saying, like, well, the whole thing that Diana is faced with is a gray area that she must get through, because it is her own moral desire or perspective or failings that is actually the problem. And so in that way, you could argue that in a historically male-dominated genre of superhero film and writing, comic book writing, going back even further, you see like fridging being a thing, where the female characters that the male loves are abused or hurt or killed in some way that furthers the male character's arc. You could argue that this is some form of that in some way, shape, or form. And without going into that and trying to dissect that, I think I'm basically just trying to say you're 100% right. I believe that it's really more about what Diana is facing morally in her character than it is about what is happening to this. I think what the storytellers thought was, it's just a faceless character. We made him handsome. We made him seem like he could be a little bit sleazy. And so maybe he would not care if this were happening to his body. If you wanted to make it a real gray area, you could have showcased that he doesn't really care about his body and made him a real dirtbag. It's what they probably would have done in the 80s, right? Like that's what they would have done in the 80s. And we would have all thought like, okay, well, it doesn't matter. But clearly it does matter, and that there is greater morality playing, and that now I think basically what I think is, I think over time, culture starts to see different moral failings in a new light. And it tends to start to focus its attention on a different kind of moral failing in a different way. The interesting thing about this to me, and I'm going to come at this from a Christ follower's perspective, is that when I look at something like the Bible, let's say, I go, a lot of this stuff has been in there from the very beginning, by the way. So in other words, culture sees these things as like, well, we've shifted culture, and now therefore this is bad. But if you were to look at like culture over throughout the decades, throughout the millennia of culture, there's always been a problem that culture is focused on, because human beings are inherently flawed. And so we just kind of pick and choose over the course of these different centuries, of these different decades, we choose the different problem to focus on. And sometimes we solve a problem, and then it kind of just goes into the background, and then the next problem is more apparent to us. And so I do think that that's something that the reason why I say that is because as a storyteller, I think that you have to go back to, doesn't have to be a Christ follower's perspective. You don't have to use a Bible as a reference, but you do have to say what is morally right and morally wrong in the world, because I am going to deal with these things in this story. And when I deal with them, it's going to look like I'm endorsing it, or it's going to look like I'm saying it's bad. And so you have to bring that to the table as a writer and say to yourself, what am I doing and why am I doing it? So I'll give you an example of how I've used it. In Death of a Bounty Hunter, we use racial slurs. Now, in the history of writing, that has off and on become a huge problem. A lot of people will say, don't read Mark Twain's works because he uses racial slurs. We don't use the same ones he uses, but it doesn't matter. They're all bad. And my point is this. I believe pretty firmly that Mark Twain was using racial slurs to showcase the negative impact that they have on the world, and that people should not use them. Could that work be interpreted in another way? Sure. I think that interpretation would be wrong based on what the story is ultimately trying to tell you, in my opinion. But I also think that as I use them, I have to now think in terms of, well, first of all, do I think a racial slur is bad? Do I think what versions of sexuality are good or bad? And then I have to work those things out in the story that I'm telling. And so as an audience, I think it's good because people are starting to pick up on the subtle things that are in stories. Then they go, wait a minute, isn't that morally wrong? Whereas in the past, we may have just said, like, who cares? I'm just going to watch the movie and treat it as a movie. So I like that. But what it does is it puts more pressure on the storyteller to be like, well, what does this actually mean? And I've had this discussion with a lot of other Christians who will read my book and go, wow, you use a lot of bad language, not just the racial. Actually, no offense to the other Christians who I've talked about this with, but a lot of times they're not really upset with the racial slurs as much as they are with the fact that I use off-color language in this book. And my thing is always like, well, yeah, I use extreme violence too. But if you're trying to think that I'm saying that either of these things is, yeah, you should go forth and do them. Like, I'm not saying that, man. Like, there's a negative consequence when these things are employed. And so I think that what you're suggesting is, look, there was a negative consequence to Wonder Woman. And yeah, this no-name character who is possessed, first of all, I think all of us would say possession of things. If we assume we can possess other people, that's bad because that's slavery. That's just automatically negative. But what you're saying is the story wasn't intended to look at that from that character's perspective. It was intended to look at it from Diana's perspective and how that activity, instead of that loving submission, it was acceptance of the possession that was negative. How that was affecting her, because it was literally destroying her. I think that's actually the deeper way that it was meant. And so I do think you should as a storyteller play with these issues, but it also helps to be hyper aware of what this is causing in your audience's brain so that you can either showcase it in a negative light and not treat it as a, well, at least Steve's back and who cares, but rather treat it as a, oh, wow, Steve's back, but the way he's back is really bad, and we see why it's really bad, and then we address why it's really bad later on in the film. And so I think that's it is a tricky subject, but I think...
Yeah, and I think you bring up an interesting point, and that is that possession stories are rape stories. And, it's in the horror genre, that's often put forth, like it's just out there that it's a violation.
Right.
But in the comedy genre, like Freaky Friday, the rape is tap danced around,
right?
And Freaky, which came out in October, I thought did a sort of an interesting. It was trying to bring those two worlds together. Yeah. It has a teenage girl and an adult male psychopath switch bodies, right. And so there is definitely a violation. They're both violated by that in different ways. But both the characters are focused on things outside of their bodies, which also enables them to be themselves and to have agency. In his case, it's murder, but
right.
So but possession stories are rape stories, and we just like, if you're a writer and you're telling a story that involves possession, just know you're telling a rape story.
Yeah,
and those are stories that can be told. Yeah. But I think a lot of times people don't want to tell a rape story and don't realize that they are. I don't think that necessarily, what I don't want to assign is I don't know where the intentionality was on any of this. And I don't know why any of these storytelling choices were made. This wouldn't have even occurred to me as a storyteller. I would have just brought him back because it's a wish. So many other things, like a giant wall appearing out of nowhere. So why couldn't a person? Right. It wouldn't have occurred to me to do this. Right. And so I know there was a train of thought that got there. Yeah. And I'm not entirely sure what it is, and I don't want to speculate what it is. I will say that it does, going back to the idea that I said, this is a story about inner conflict versus outer conflict. What the thing does is it makes her relationship inner as well, because no one else can see him. no one else knows he's there, or even if they see him, they don't truly see him. So it puts all of this stuff inside of her and inside of this man's body, and that's certainly that goes with some of the themes of the film, but I don't know if it's just because those themes are around it, and I certainly don't want to say that it's intentional, but yeah, it's definitely problematic. And I think that we don't like it when someone that we want to see as a hero does something really, really wrong. But
it's also really a powerful tool.
Real life heroes and fictional heroes can do something that's really, really wrong. And if we feel good about it, that's a problem. Yes. If we feel disturbed by it, then I think we're at least having the correct moral reaction, I guess.
Yeah. And this is a good transition into the next question, because I would argue that if we had seen this possession as something that Diana was viewing as possession and not just viewing as Steve being back. And again, there might be several scenes on the cutting room floor that showcase how she's struggling with this aspect of sometimes she sees it's Steve and sometimes she sees it's the other guy. And she's like, whoa, this is really freaking me out. This is a very difficult thing for me to deal with. I think that may have solved a lot of these problems. It doesn't make the lead character sinless. What it does is it means that the lead character is more like us, right? The lead character is doing things in his or her life, in this case, Diana's life, that she goes, oh, wait a minute. I don't know that I'm doing this the right way. I may be hurting someone else. Now, this is a very extreme version of that, but I may be hurting someone else by doing this thing. And I think that would have been really powerful. And I think that I like that you have taken it and said, look, that's actually what's going on. It's just that they weren't really specific about this particular thing, because I think that that's a really good way to view it. And I think the thing I would say to everyone out there listening is these things should disturb you, and you should think to yourself, what's the better way? And by the way, this is just my, this is, you probably don't want to be preached to today, and I apologize for doing this to you, but this is why I am a Christ follower, because people are in need of salvation. And because people are not perfect, and because you cannot justify yourself in any sort of behavior, because if you try to, you will fail because you are an imperfect human, where will you get your salvation from? We just heard recently there's a news story about another Christian leader who has these giant moral failings in his past. And I go, yeah, obviously we would hope that the Spirit would work through us, that we would transform a lot of our behavior. But guess what? Every human being, even if they have been saved spiritually through Christ, is still a dirtbag, even their thoughts or their actions in some way, shape, or form, because every human is. And that's just another reiteration of why we need something beyond ourselves. And so I like the superhero genre oftentimes encourages us to be the Moses, to to justify ourselves by being a better person. But I like it even better. And this is why I like a lot of the Wonder Woman films, when we go, actually, everybody's imperfect. That's just what we have to. There's no way of getting to perfection. You can't keep working your way. You can work your way to a better place, but you can't work your way to perfection. And what are you going to do with that? And so I kind of like that. So I apologize for the preachiness, but I like that aspect of it.
Here's something. This is a half-formed thought, so I'm not sure.
I love half-formed thoughts.
I'm not going to stand by it tomorrow, but just to throw this out to people who are storytellers. And thinking about the stories that you tell, if you really dig into it, the wishing mechanic of the story, the entire mechanic of that is a violation of consent. people are asking for one thing and they are not getting what they're, their consent is being violated. They would not have consented if they understood,
Right.
And so then you get into all sorts of, but what's in, but some violations of consent are more acceptable to us as a culture, or just considered less egregious. And there are some violations of consent that probably are less egregious,
Sure.
And so when you're telling a story, just do your best to think about the true mechanics of your story and not the cultural acceptances of the mechanics of your story. You made an interesting comment earlier that in the 80s, they probably would have done this, or,
Right.
or, like this might not even, this would not have been met with this reaction,
Right.
In the 90s.
Right.
But was that right or wrong? Like culture,
Correct.
what culture was blind to that dynamic, or just not looking very closely at it. But that doesn't mean that the dynamic was any less wrong. And so when you're telling a story, try to think about what you might be putting into your story that perhaps you're just culturally blind to right now. But in a decade or two, people will consider horribly wrong, morally wrong. As some of that is changing conventions, but I also just think some of that is us growing as a species, that new things are brought to light and we're like, oh my gosh, like how did we let that go on so long? And
Right.
And it just, and that keeps happening. And we have a limited capacity to do this.
Yeah.
But just what are we taking as culturally acceptable that shouldn't be?
Yep.
In putting into our stories. Think about that as a storyteller.
Yeah, this is it's most obvious, I think, too, when you look at, whenever you hear someone say, "Oh man, I just really miss the good old days," right? And you hear, a lot of times you'll hear people say that who will say, "Wow, I just really think that we had a better perspective." And you hear this a lot in terms of America, the United States, and you'll hear it said politically, is that, wow, we should go back to when America was a really great place, right? And this is not a political statement, so don't follow that line of thinking. The problem is, on whose behalf are you thinking that? Because if you say, well, the 50s was a really great decade, I wish we could go back to that. People were more moral. We didn't see all this immorality. Like television had actually, like, the FCC was actually, not letting certain things on television and blah, blah,
Married
blah.
couples didn't sleep in the same bed.
Right. They said, yeah, but how did we treat people of color in the 50s? Not real well. We had a bad track record. So you can basically say, you can always wish back to something where the world was a little better. You can always wish for the world to be a little better in another way. But guess what's happening? The world is probably failing in a different way, because that's the way it works. We are not perfect. And so therefore, we will pick our definition. Culture will always pick its definition of what right and wrong is. You as a storyteller have to go, yeah, what is my definition of right or wrong? Where am I getting that definition from? And how does it then appear in my stories? And guess what? If it's just your personal take, then it might change, because the world is going to change. And if it comes from another place, if it comes from, some holy book that you respect, culture might actually hate that perspective at certain points in time as well. So you may never be 100% right, and you have to do the best job that you can possibly do in your stories with what you're given. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, and sorry, I keep thinking more about this as I was just doing a lot of research in culture a couple of months ago, because I am the working culture director at the church where I work in. So I've been thinking about this in particular lately, is that sociologists emphasize, and I think they're correct, that we are more cultural artifact than cultural agent. Our culture shapes us far more than we shape it. But because we're a hyper individualistic culture, we don't tend to believe that.
Right.
We believe, no, I can change culture, or even just this idea that I'm separate from culture. Yeah. I'm looking at culture and interacting with culture. You're not. You're drowning in culture. And the David Foster Wallace, at the beginning of his little speech, "This is Water," which has been collected as a book, he tells the parable. Two fish are swimming along. They pass an older fish. The older fish says, "How's the water?" And then they keep going, and then one of the fish turns to the other one and says, "What's water?" And that's culture. We are breathing it, and we don't understand how pervasive our culture is and how much a product of our culture we are.
Yeah.
But as a culture maker, as a professional culture maker, as a storyteller, that's just something that you really need to think about, because just understanding that means that you're going to look for the ways culture is acting on you, and you're not going to have, because if your default position is I'm acting on culture, you're going to miss a lot of those things that are culturally acceptable now, but shouldn't be. You're going to be blind to a lot of stuff. And the truth is, you will still be blind, but at least you will be looking for your blind spots. If you're aware that culture shapes you more than you shape culture, and culture defines you more than you will define culture. So I'm just, again, talking that applies to anyone, but storytellers in particular, just you need to know and wrestle with that reality.
Yeah. And as somebody who has wrestled with that in the past, it's really fascinating, because, you will start to, the first process is to deconstruct your own worldview. And a lot of people do that and stop. And they go, well, I guess nothing is attainable, and I can't really believe in anything, because anything I deconstruct, it's very difficult to rebuild back. I would encourage people to deconstruct and then reconstruct, because without the reconstruction, you can only tell a dystopian nightmare story. You need to be able to say, what are the other things that I'm going to build back into my worldview, my perspective, so that I can showcase what a moral perspective may look like. So anyways, I think that's really cool. And we got a comment, and you just responded to the comment, which is awesome. But CF
interesting.
says,
my response says it's from the Reclamation Society.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's great. You're part of the Reclamation Society. That works. That is why people cheat with Portal Fantasy, to bring the outsider so the fantasy culture can be explained. And as you said, great example. Mm-hmm. So I want to transition into this next question. We have 2 questions left. We're already way over time. How are you on time? Are you good on time? Yeah. Okay. So Wonder Woman 1984 uses 2 different villains, Max Lord and Cheetah. And in thinking about that, I realized that a ton of the comic book superhero stories, especially DC, they use 2 villains. So the first film had the Germans, and there was actually 2, the lady with the face mask, and also I think his name was like Ludenberg or something like that. He was also like seen as a villain. But then you also had Ares. The Dark Knight had Joker and Two-Face. Captain America Civil War, this is a kind of a bad example, but you had like the villain hero dynamic between Cap and Tony, and you had Zemo. But it's actually, I could not find as many examples of 2 bad guys on the Marvel side. Batman v Superman has Luthor and Doomsday. So the question for storytellers is, there's 2 villains in this story. Does that tend to work well for stories? And how do you think it worked here in 1984? So a quick shout out to Tanya Simmerer in the Story Geeks Facebook group for prompting that question. But I want to turn that question over to you. How do you think it works here? And how should storytellers kind of consider this 2 villain dynamic?
I'll start by saying I actually don't think it's a 2 villain dynamic. It's a 2 antagonist dynamic. I don't think either of these characters are villains. I think villainy implies a certain evil intent. And ultimately, they're victims of their desires. as much as other people are victims of their desires. You know, and they spread it, and they're hurt, and they hurt others. But what's different about this film from the first Wonder Woman film is that Wonder Woman is actively trying to save both of them. She's not fighting them. She's fighting for them in all the physical confrontations. She's fighting for them. And you don't get that with the Germans in World War One. And this is part of why I don't like World War One and World War Two stories. I think we've given ourselves permission to dehumanize, to create a completely dehuman villain that's also human. And we tell that story to ourselves over and over and over again, which is why we still have Nazis in our culture, because we just keep telling ourselves that story and keep telling ourselves that story. And so the Germans are this sort of dehumanized, faceless, and you actually fight them. You fight the Germans. But she's fighting for Maxwell and Lord and Cheetah. And that is actually why this is higher. And why I like this film better is because all the uses of physical force, she is fighting for someone, not against, you know. She has to go against people, you know, as part of the going for. And there's some amazing action scenes and set pieces, and it's very beautiful and poetic in some places, and a little brutal in others. But yes, so that makes it not quite a straight villain story in the same way that you get in a lot of superhero dynamics, and that keeps it from being a pure might makes right story. Which again is part of the reason Wonder Woman can do that is she's only a third superhero. She's also, you know, myth and pulp adventurer. And but I think ultimately the reason to do that as a storyteller is that it simply gives you more combinations of conflict. There are more dynamics at play, which creates more creates more conflict or more possibilities of conflict. It just gives you more options as a storyteller. It's the difference between playing a game of chess and imagining what a game of chess would be like if there was 3 players. You know, a game of chess has some set pieces at work. It's actually, I think you can actually learn a lot about storytelling by studying chess, because chess is two groups of characters in conflict. And you see that in most movies, particularly superhero movies. You have these 2 groups of characters, often evenly matched in some way, in conflict. And that comes out in chess. And I think you can actually learn some interesting storytelling techniques by watching the dynamics of chess. But imagine a triangular board with 3 players, and those already near infinite dynamics become a much bigger infinity. And so I think that's part of why you see it is, if you want, I just think it's practical from story. It just gives you so many more options.
That's good. A couple more comments from CF. Villains should be foils for each other when you have multiple ones. I think it works well if they have diverging goals interactions. The trope of the hero that tries to save everyone, though oftentimes is the best stories, are where that goes bad. I'd recommend Drew Hayes' Villain's Code if you want to look at the trope in superhero fiction. And you can look at that, I think, with Thanos, for example, as the guy who thinks he's saving the universe, but in reality is being very damaging to it. I think there's to respond to your comment, Caleb, I think you and I probably have very different definitions of what it means to be a villain. Because I do think that these two are villains, because I'm not sure that the motivation is part of what makes a villain. But I think the behavior is more of what makes a villain than the motivations are. And I think Thanos is a good example of that. However, I love the concept of the chessboard and how writers can learn from the definitions of chess, of playing between 2 people or 3 people. I think that the danger of using more characters, and I think this is very true of the DCEU when I talk about them using so many villains all the time. I think sometimes, and I think the DCEU I think is guilty of this more so than Marvel is that they're actually trying to sell the story based on the characters who are in the story, almost as opposed to selling the story for the story's worth and the fact that these characters will be included in helping tell that story. And what I mean by that is it feels like you could actually have this film without Cheetah in it at all. You didn't need Cheetah almost. And all the characters in my mind in the best kinds of stories, especially movies, because you don't have as much time as you might in like a novel, are again augmenting the central premise. And it's hard to augment the central premise if you get too divergent with characters who are not dealing with the same central issue. Now, in this case, they are all sort of dealing with the same issue in one way or another. And by the way, the way that you end up dealing with that central issue is usually what makes you a hero or a villain. Like, for example, if two characters are struggling with the same thing at the beginning of a story, oftentimes the villain will double down while the hero changes their perspective and goes like kind of the more holistic way where the villain just goes, no, I don't care what anyone else thinks. I'm doing this. And so I do think that from a storytelling perspective, I do think that stories require a certain amount of focus. And it's hard if you were to say, whose story is this? That's the best question you can possibly ask for a lot of stories, because when you look at Infinity War, it's Thanos' story. They're not trying to spend. There are other subplots that are doing other subplotty things, but that's Thanos' story. In this case, I would go, well, I think actually it's Maxwell Lord's ultimate story. In fact, if he doesn't make the decision he makes, you could argue that, again, without a fight against him, this story doesn't resolve itself. I love that, but also I think this story spends a lot of time going, I think it's also Wonder Woman's story, and also we have Cheetah, and I think it's also her story. And I think that for me gets a little bit more convoluted, and I would like them to be a little bit more all on the same page and trying to prove out the premise. And I think it would have been a little bit easier for me to take in if I had gotten, this is the central character, this is who we are worried about, and all these other characters are going to augment that character's arc.
Yeah, I have a question for you, and then a thought.
Yes.
The question is, so you said that you consider them villains because of the actions they take.
Mm-hmm.
But Maxwell Lord's final action is, in one sense, literally undoes all of his previous. So does that mean he's still a villain, or is he just a villain for part of the film? I want to hear a little more.
Yeah. It's a good question. So I do think that he has, in the end, he is turned into someone who is not a villain anymore. Probably not the same case with Cheetah, because there's no evidence that Cheetah actually recants her wish, right? I don't think so. It's not necessarily. It's gray, I think, in that regard. But he definitely does. He definitely goes back on his selfish desires, right? He then says, oh, I've been doing all this stuff for selfish reasons, and I should not have done that for selfish reasons. I should. So yeah, he doesn't end as a. You wouldn't say he ends as a hero, because you guys kind of just. He doesn't ever get back to an even playing field by doing something incredibly self-sacrificial. He just sort of reverses the thing that he's already done. And so I don't know if I'd call him a hero, but they definitely have him on an arc where he realizes that he is a villain, as opposed to Thanos, who dies believing that his way was the right way to do it. Right. Even Killmonger dies going, look, man, let me see the sunset one last time, because I'm not going to say I'm sorry for any of the things that I believe or any of the things that I've done. So I would have said a lot of times how the character ends the story is how you would classify them. They make a selfless decision. That's kind of in my basic premise is, if you're going along and you make selfless decisions, you're turning towards the hero's path. If you go along and you make selfish decisions, you're choosing the villain's path. This movie muddies that in the end, and along the way you see Wonder Woman kind of making some selfish choices, not recanting her wish as early as she could have. But ultimately, I do think that Maxwell Lord is pursuing selfishness for 90% of the movie, if not 95. Wonder Woman, after realizing what's going on, then changes her perspective and starts choosing selfless things. And then in the end, everyone's a hero because everyone recants their wish, right? So that does muddy the waters a little bit, but I do think most of the movie they're spent as villains, basically.
Yeah, and CF, just brings up the point that Wonder Woman and Steve Trevor using that man's body is a villain choice.
Yes, it is.
So you have to, so you're weighing the villain versus the hero choices.
Yep.
And every character ideally should have both at some point.
Correct.
You don't want someone who's always selfless or always selfish. You want
they have to have an arc.
That's
dehumanizing. They have to go somewhere.
That's dehumanizing exactly. Either way. It's dehumanizing to always be selfless. It's dehumanizing to be to always be selfish. But my thought, and as you're talking, I actually had another one. So I'm going to share.
Nice.
The second thought is that you really almost have a 4-character film because Barbara and Cheetah are not really the same character. She trades herself for power. Yeah. And she is no longer herself. She has traded away her joy and her warmth. Yep. Which means she no longer can make the heroic choice because the part of her that can make the heroic choice, she gave away. Yeah. Which is why I think she didn't recant at the end, because I don't think she can. The part of her that would understand recanting is gone. Yeah. And so in that sense, she becomes a different person with different choices, and different. So you almost have a 4. You can almost look at it as a 4-character movie. But my first thought was, I love musicals, and I love musicals from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and I was recently watching Broadway Melody of 1939, which has my 2 favorite tap dancers of all time, Eleanor Powell and Fred Astaire. I think Powell is Astaire's greatest dance partner, even though Rogers is certainly no slouch, but I just think that Powell was a once in a art form. Artist when it comes to dancing, just like Astaire was. But as I was watching it, and I love these things, it really hammered home to me how simple the story was. And as I've watched other musicals since then, I'm like, oh wow, these are really simple, straightforward stories because they have to create room for the musical numbers. So a 90-minute movie that's musical numbers is really an hour of story. It's not an hour and a half of story. Exactly. And the best use the musical numbers as part of the story, but songs are not efficient ways to move story. They're certainly more poetic ways, but they're not efficient. And so I think that's another math that you have to understand as a writer, is that the more characters you add, or musical numbers, or action scenes, which are basically musical numbers, where the plot pauses for a minute and there's lots of visuals, and then then we get back to the nitty gritty of plot. Sex scenes as well. Sex scenes, musical numbers, and action scenes all play very similar roles as far as what is happening to your narrative there.
Great point.
But every character you add, the simpler your story will need to be. Because, or at least the simpler the arc each of them will need. Because if it takes 2 hours to really portray a complex arc in someone, like, say, Michael Clayton, but if you're giving that character half the time, because you've got a villain who's getting half the time, then that arc has to be simpler. And when you add a third, and when you add a fourth, and when you add a fifth, again, that's just something you need to be aware of as a storyteller, that your desire for rich characters and your desire for variety of characters, there is a little bit of a natural and conflict between those.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially in time or page count or word count limited stories.
Yep. And I would compliment the MCU in that regard, because the MCU basically said, first of all, we're going to take like B-level characters instead of A-level characters like Superman. I just mean popularity-wise. And the villains were terrible on a lot of the MCU films in the beginning. And who cared, right? None of us cared because it was like, this film is not about the villain. This film, the villain serves as either a protagonist for the negative thing, and the hero serves as an antagonist trying to stop them, or, however, vice versa you want to play that. And I think that worked really, really well. And it helped us believe those characters, want to see those characters in more complex stories. But I think the MCU does that really well, is that the MCU knows it's this character story. This is the story we're telling. We're going after it. We should do an entire episode on heroes and villains. I've done a lot of actually thinking on the topic. And obviously, you're going to have me think in one very specific way. And that is, anybody who only exists in a story as a hero or a villain is too simplistic of a character, and you probably shouldn't be writing that character to begin with. Because,
I will accept it in a musical, though.
Well, there are certain stories you would definitely accept it in, right? Like,
yeah,
well, it's just fine. Like, just let it be what it is. But to your point about us seeing the world, tribalism means that we see our own tribe as having the morally superior viewpoint, and we see other tribes as having the morally inferior viewpoint. And therefore, since we are superior to them, we can do whatever we want to them. That's what racism is. That's what Nazism is. That's what a lot of times nationalism is, if you're not careful.
That's what confirmation bias is.
It's what confirmation bias. This is. We cannot see the other tribe as being less than. We can see them as being different than, and then trying to understand, where do they have things that are better than what we have? Where do we have things? I'm not asking you to see everyone as equally the same. That's not true either. But I think that the more complex we want our stories to be, as the more morally interesting we want our stories to be. We cannot just say, this is a perfect character, and he will move through the story as a perfect character, and he will never be tempted by anything because he is so heroic. He would never do anything selfish. And then vice versa, if our villains are only just pure evil, it just makes for a much less interesting story. So you can do it, but maybe I won't be watching it as much. But let's end on a positive note. I would love to end on a positive note because I really enjoy the DCEU. Obviously, you do as well. This is your favorite film. There are some fantastic aspects to this film. So my question is, what are the storytelling elements? What are some of the storytelling elements that we see here in Wonder Woman 1984 that you think really, really work?
I think I've brought a lot of them up over time, but I think that the idea that I like the anti-utopian idea that a broken world is still a beautiful world. That to me is that is a mature theme to tackle. In what is not always a mature genre or medium. And I really like the fact, like I said, that Wonder Woman is fighting for and not against. That is what really makes it dear to my heart. The idea of fighting for and not against. And the fact that it is not a might makes right story. Like, all of these are things that I just really admire about it. And that's what raises it in my estimation, as far as my ranking of DC movies. I would say it does those things really well. I think that it has a good sense of tragedy, which superhero films do not often have. But there is genuine tragedy. One of the biggest ones is the idea that by wishing for what she wishes, Barbara can no longer recant what she wished for, and things like that. That's very tragic. And tragedy in superhero films is often very surfacey.
Yes.
But just
as showcased by the giant beam of light coming down, and the world's gonna die, and there's all this swirling material, as such a trope for so long. It's like okay, yeah, that's obviously tragic, right? Like it's so blatant.
Yeah. So I think all of that creates some sort of alchemy about why it really hit with me. What about you?
Yeah, I think that all those things are really, really, really great. For me, I love the premise. I'll go back to that. I love the fact that I think that any storyteller that says, look, I'm going to go out with a premise that says that's going to test a certain thing about the world. What are we testing about the world? We are testing that we could pursue what we want. And even though we can see the world falling apart around us, it's okay because we're getting what we want, right? What it's basically doing is it's testing the premise that we should view ourselves as an individualistic society, and that if we were to carry that out to the nth degree, even in light of other people losing, it's okay because we got what we wanted. And I think it's testing that premise and saying, like, that premise is totally bogus. And if we had a hero put into a place where even their most desired thing can be given to them, can be gifted to them, they would have to realize, they would be the first one to realize. A true hero would be the first one to realize, oh, this is not good. And actually, it's even worse for Diana because by accepting to keep her power, she could just become human like anybody else and be like, well, I have Steve, so it doesn't matter. What she has to actually choose is that I have to choose, because I am one of the only, obviously there's the other DC heroes, but I'm in this situation, I'm one of the only super powered people that can actually help humanity, meaning I have to give up of my own desire, and then I have to go give up of my own physicality because I'm the only one that can do it. And so even though I might not even want this thing as much as I want the other thing, I have to give it up. I think that's a really great message. I actually think that the fact that Max Lord has to realize what he realizes is actually really important too, and go back on what he was doing, and a lot of these people see that, because I think what it does is it suggests to us as a culture that we should not want our thing if it comes at the expense of everybody else's thing. And that is a message that I think is really great to infuse into culture kind of again and again and again, because I think a lot of us can get that wrong, especially in the Western world where we've been told so many times that what you want is what you should get. And so you deserve it almost. Just look at our advertising and how many people say, do you really deserve it? I don't know. I also think that I thought that actually, this is something that I started watching the mall scene, and my first response to the mall scene was like, oh, the mall scene is kind of cheesy. And my wife was sitting there and she turned to me and she goes, oh, this is kind of cool. It really feels like an 80s movie. And I went, oh, of course. That's of course what they were trying to do. And it changed my whole entire perspective of the mall scene. And now I love it because I go, yeah, it feels like I'm watching Stranger Things season 3 where they're in the mall. Like it's not trying to be like, it's not trying to be avant-garde filmmaking. It's trying to be like, what was it like when we watched movies in the 80s? And that's kind of what it was like. It kind of felt like those things. The villains were kind of these really cheesy guys who were like, oh, I'm going to grab a kid. I think that's kind of cool. I think that's kind of fun. I think that the way that they did that was really good. And then the last thing I would compliment this film on is that, first of all, I love Patty Jenkins for taking the risks that she takes. In Wonder Woman 1, having Gal Gadot say, I do these things for love, could have been the cheesiest moment in the history of superhero films, against maybe some of the things we saw in the 70s and 80s in superhero films. But it wasn't. It was really meaningful. And I think that, so Patty Jenkins is saying, I'm going to take the genre and I'm going to dig into the genre as deep as I can, I think. And I think she's doing a really good job of that. So I love that. I love the fact that Gal Gadot, if you would have told me Gal Gadot's going to be, well, this is what I felt like when they said Gal Gadot's going to be Wonder Woman. I'm like, wow, she's so skinny and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean she's petite. How is she going to play this super powered character? Gal Gadot is the best choice for Wonder Woman that they ever could have had. She's amazing in the role. And I really enjoyed Pedro Pascal in this. I've enjoyed him in everything, actually, but I really enjoyed him in this as well, because what Patty Jenkins did on the set, and I'm going to give the credit to her because I think that this is what a director has to do. A director has to get everybody, even if they don't believe in the script, even if they don't like some of the ways that the film is being set up from a visual perspective, even if they don't understand the character motivations, if they buy into the fact that this character is important and this character you need to believe in the character you're playing. That's a huge thing. And Patty Jenkins definitely got her cast to do that, because every single one of them appears to deeply believe in the character they're playing. And that's phenomenal. And so that's the last thing I would.
That's one thing that I was. You got, as you were talking, it occurred to me one other thing that I really liked about the film that I thought it did really well was casting. You got 4 really good performances, and there is a alchemy to that, to actors being great, but you also they need great material to work with, and they need great direction. And it's really hard to sort of tell where the DNA of those are. But when all the performances in a film are good, that speaks really well of the director and writer. And like you said, that one line could have been super cheesy, but a lot of that is, whether it's cheesy or not, is how it's delivered.
Exactly.
And so yeah, I thought there was 4 really great performances, and that was another strength of the film.
Absolutely. Well, that's it. We almost went 2 hours, man. This has been our longest show yet. Just the 2 of us almost going 2 hours. But that is it for today's show. Don't forget to check out Death of a Bounty Hunter, Nathan and I's novel. And also check out The Mongolian Connection, the movie that Caleb co-wrote. They're both available on Amazon, so you can go search for Death of a Bounty Hunter or The Mongolian Connection. You can find those. If you do check those out, let us know what you think. We're always trying to do this storytelling thing. We're always trying to do it a little better. So feedback is good in that regard as well. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. You can subscribe either here on YouTube. You can join the Story Geeks Facebook group. If you don't post this to that Facebook group, but I do. You can like the Reclamation Society page. There's so many places where you can find our content. You can find it on there. And then also, if you subscribe to the Story Geeks podcast channel, which is available basically on all the podcast providers out there, just pick the one you prefer. You can subscribe to that. This show will be appearing on that podcast channel as well. Any last thoughts, Caleb?
Nope. I think I'm drained of
we
thought.
covered it. We covered it all. Yeah. So thanks for listening. And as always, question everything and always seek the truth. And I just want to give a special thanks to our monthly supporters. Here are some of the awesome supporters who support us at $5 a month or more every month over on Patreon. Adam Vargas, Justin Weaver, Mary Baldwin, Wade Johnson, Jim Baldwin, Kimberly Lejeau, who, by the way, hosted a Best Christmas Movie Comedy Nerd Fight a couple weeks ago on the Story Geeks channel, which was awesome. Monty Thigpen, Nick Prokop, and Connie Moe. We appreciate all of our supporters, even those we haven't mentioned by name. Please consider supporting us, even if it's only a couple dollars a month. Learn more at patreon.com/thestorygeeks. And thanks to CF today for bringing the comments. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that's where we'll end it.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Come back in a couple weeks. We're not sure what we're talking about yet, but it will be something interesting.
I'm going to throw it out. I think we should talk about what we can learn from the past as in 2020, and talk about what it means to set writing goals.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
As we're here at the beginning of the year.
Perfect. What did we learn from the past, and being 2020, and what can we do in terms of setting writing goals for 2021? I dig it. 2 weeks from today, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Join us then. We'll talk to you guys later.
All right.